First, I want to thank everybody for coming out and being a part of this. Did everybody sign the sign-up sheet? Is there anybody who didn't? We got a couple here that didn't sign the sign-up sheet yet, so we'll get that around to you. But my name is Chris Albright. I am a resident here in East Palestine. Live right down the street here, less than a half a mile away from where the train derailed. Since then, like a lot of you guys, I have been heavily affected by the train derailment. I have suffered through severe heart failure, and my family has suffered through a lot of different things too. It hasn't been the best year for a lot of us, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have been, kept up to speed on what happened at the courthouse the other day, and we got railroaded, basically, is what happened. We have a lot of information and a lot of evidence and a lot of facts that the judge would not admit in court. And because of that, we have to accept what they're doing. Only we're not going to lay down and accept it. We're still here fighting, guys. This isn't over yet. We're not done yet. Today we have a very esteemed professor here, basically, doctor, who is going to present some of his findings. Some of the things about Dr. George Thompson, who's going to be coming up here talking. He has been in the toxicology field for over 55 years. He has been an expert witness in over 56 cases. Dr. Thompson has no stake in this. He's not from here. He has no family here. He has nothing to gain by him presenting this information he has. He actually came out of retirement to help us. I mean, that's an amazing thing in and of itself, for him to come out of retirement. Because he saw this, and he saw how wrong it was, and how bad we're getting screwed over, and how bad these chemicals are, and what these chemicals are going to do. I've been involved in this fight now since it happened, basically. I've been across the country, and I've talked to a lot of different places. And I've never seen a presentation quite like the one you're going to see today, presented by Dr. Thompson. The information he has will blow you away. And if you don't leave here angry and pissed off, there's something wrong with you, because he has more information than I've seen yet. And it's amazing. And it's appalling that the judge wouldn't let him testify in court. This man here alone could have helped us out immensely. So without further ado, guys, I want to thank you guys for being here, and I would like to introduce Dr. George Thompson. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thanks, Chris. Now, you can tell that the magnification isn't going to be the greatest here, so I'm not presuming that you're going to be able to see all of the charts. I can't see them either if I'm looking at the screen, but I have the advantage of looking at the computer here, so at least I can see that much. But in preparing for this presentation, and I've given much of it many times over Zoom, but in preparing to come here, I've talked to enough people from East Palestine to know that there's a huge amount of uncertainty for each one of you. And the certain part that I'm going to present to you today wouldn't necessarily address the uncertain feelings that you have. And so the context here is that I added to my presentation the idea of giving you a message of hope. And if you wouldn't mind, I would like to start this with a prayer. If you would indulge me in that, because I think this is bigger than you, it's bigger than me, and I think there's a righteous purpose in what's happened here in this community. So if you just join me for a moment in prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, we, a few of thy children, are assembled here together this day to increase our understanding of what has actually transpired here in this community. back in 2023. Father, we desire to understand thy will, and we desire to fulfill thy purposes in each aspect of our lives. We pray for thy revelator, for thy Holy Spirit to be here this day, that the attendees will feel of thy love and feel of thy inspiration as they hear the message that is conveyed. I pray that I may be clear in my communication to them in an understandable way that will help relieve some of their uncertainties and anxieties. And we dedicate this meeting unto thee, and we do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you. The message of hope is probably the hardest part of this for me. The science that I'm going to communicate to you about the toxicology and medical concerns is very straightforward. I've done it hundreds, maybe thousands of times in my career. But that doesn't necessarily address the rest of it. So if we can have the first chart, please. Just to give you a little background about myself, which you can't see, but Chris has already mentioned I've been a toxicologist for 55 years. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, I was working on this presentation and realized that God led me to become a toxicologist. I wanted to be a professional baseball player. Didn't get there. And I'd never heard of toxicology before I went to interview in a program at Oregon State University that wanted to pay me to go to college. I'd been working my fingers to the bone to try and pay off my college, and suddenly somebody was willing to pay me. Never heard of it. They happened to have a grant from the National Institute of Health and didn't have a student to fill it. I was a student with no money and an interest in learning medical science. And when they talked to me about what toxicology was about, I said, that's something that I can be very interested in. Now, let's see, where did I put it? I have a pointer somewhere. Right here, this is all. Okay, the toxicology is a mixed science. And when I was in graduate school, actually just slightly before I went into graduate school, this is a science that was created because it's a synthesis. It's the synthesis here of chemistry, of medical and biology, and environmental. So I know a lot about chemistry. You're going to hear about some of that today. But I also have studied a lot about medicine, which was where I thought I was originally going to go, was into become a doctor. Did become a doctor, but not an MD. And that led me then into looking at environmental things. And over the 55 years of my career, that has all been enhanced. But I got in those college years. And I couldn't have foreseen as a young 25-year-old kid where I was going to end up, that I would be here today. Couldn't imagine where this would lead me. But about 3 weeks ago, I realized that the 55 years I've been a toxicologist was training for East Palestine. All of the background that I've had in industry, in academia, working on for government agencies, is all synthesized into trying to analyze the problem here. I want you to feel today that I was sent here by God as a token of His love for you, recognizing that there are things you don't know and understand. There are things that I do understand, and there's a lot that I don't. But it's through Him that I'm hoping that you'll get the message before this is over as to what He wants you to do with this situation. It's not a punishment. It's not because He doesn't love you. In fact, I've found as I look back over my life, the trials and tribulations that have been most painful for me have resulted in the greatest blessings. I waited 18 years to father a child. And then my wife, my new wife, if you will, and I married late in life, and 4 years later, she finally got pregnant. In the next 6 years, she had 5 babies, all by cesarean. It was such trauma for her body that when our son, who drove me here, an autistic son, who is now developed and drove me here the 6-hour drive and got me here to this church, that when he was born in October, her incision didn't heal until June the next year. It almost killed her to have those 5 babies. And what do you think is the best thing in our lives now? Those 5 babies. The trauma along the way, we can look back and proudly say, they're good kids. We still call them kids. That's this situation. You are being tested, no question about it, in ways that I haven't seen before. This event that you are living through is the worst toxicology problem I've seen in 55 years. So welcome to the big leagues. Lucky you that you get to be in the middle of it. But as I've said before, the greater the trial, the greater the blessings that follow. And I hope that one of the questions you're asking yourself is, why me, and what does God want me to do about this? He trained me 55 years ago to be here today. Next slide. So one of the things that happened is that when your accident occurred on the 3rd of February, 2023, I saw this on the news like people all over the country. And I was attentive to it. And I was impressed with the magnitude of the fires and the plumes. And of course it was on every night and every night and every night, and it just kept going. And then about a week or 10 days later, the head of the EPA for the United States came out and said, it's all safe, you can come back. And I was stunned. I said, there's no way that it could be safe in that community. But what do I know? So I went online and I found the manifest for the train on Norfolk Southern's website. I downloaded it, and it listed the chemicals and products that were in each of the cars that derailed, in their words, not mine, not my interpretation, but what they had. And so what I realized is that the precipitating factor is that on the 3rd of December you had the event, and the 8th the evacuation order was lifted, and by the 15th they said it's all safe. That didn't hit me as realistic. And since then, frankly, the people who should be protecting them have tried to justify that decision and those actions. And so I'm here to give you a little different story. Next slide, please. So I went in, and you can't see any of this, so I'm just going to tell you that when I got to the website and I downloaded their manifest, there were 9 pieces of information in the table that was created by them, by Norfolk Southern. And it was highly detailed. It identified each rail car by its number, by what was in it, what type of rail car it was, and more importantly, there's a column over here that you can't see. Maybe you can see those red indications. But those indicated where they said that the car burned. But they used a term that I didn't really know what it meant, and I studied it to try and figure it out. And they said that there were other cars. There were 17 that burned. But there were 15 more that they said were impinged. Fire or flame impinged. I don't know what that means. I looked it up. I know what impinged means, but I didn't know what it meant in the context is. And it suggested to me that maybe they were just scorched on the outside, until I started seeing the pictures in the news media. And there weren't any scorched cars full of product. They were all empty. So I included them in my analysis. So there were, just to remember now, there were 17 that they said burned, not me. And there were 15 that they said burned. And so of the 52 cars that derailed, 32 of them were involved in that fire. Now, again, you can't read this, but this is my analysis. Over here, there are going to be two charts here that are together, but over here are 13 chemicals or products that they identified being in those cars. They also identified, by the, as I mentioned, the rail car numbers. So they also identified in this column what rail car was it in. So some of them were in one rail car. The vinyl chloride that has made the news most often was in 5 different rail cars. And they also told, as I mentioned, the type of rail car. Well, one day I was thinking, and the good Lord said, George, how much material's in one of those rail cars? So I went on our magic tool, the internet, and I looked up a tanker car, and I looked up a box car, and I looked up the different kinds of rail cars. And they were in the range of 180 to 220,000 pounds each. So when you hear about vinyl chloride, and there are 5 cars, that's about 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride. And most of the time they talk about releasing that so they could burn it. And the context then is, when you think about it, they released 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride and known carcinogen. Nobody debates that, including Norfolk Southern or the attorneys. That they released 1 million pounds of it. You never hear that, how much there was. Sometimes they'll tell you 5 carloads, but nobody's done the math and said, that means there was 1 million pounds of vinyl chloride released into your communities from those rail cars and set on fire. Now that didn't happen until the 6th of February, but that's a lot of stuff. And let's see, the other element that you can see is that you'll see that there are 3 things here that I have in yellow. Can we go to the next slide? And on this slide, which is the rest of those 24 chemicals and products, you'll see that there are 5 yellow indications here. Okay. The yellow indications, 3 on the first chart and 5 on the second, are all chemicals that, or products that cause cancer. Vinyl chloride's one. But there were things like hydraulic cement. It was a rail car filled with powdered cement, if you will. And that's known to cause cancer. And so I created this chart and I said, wow, that's a lot of stuff and a lot of hazards. And one day I had this thought come into my mind that said, what happens when it was burned? I've never done burn analyses, combustion analyses before from a toxicology viewpoint. So I took the first one, polypropylene. It's plastic pellets. And those you can handle without any danger. They're inert. But there's a whole train car full of them. And what did I find when I asked what happens when you burn an inert product? All kinds of poisons are released in the fire by burning plastic. And that'd be true if you did it in your backyard burn. And so the whole issue suddenly mushroomed in front of me. It wasn't what was on the train that was the problem. It's what came out of the fire that was problem. And so I went through each of these products here, one by one, and researched what's produced, what does it produce when it's released, when it's burned. And the problem is, as you experienced, it wasn't completely consumed by the combustion. It's what's called incomplete combustion. And the difference between incomplete and complete combustion is if it's complete combustion, it all burns to carbon dioxide and water. In incomplete combustion, what you see coming up in that plume is carbon. It's not all burned. And the problem with carbon coming up in the plume is that carbon acts like a sponge. Carbon by itself, as it shows over here on a couple of these charts, carbon by itself, soot and ash that came from that, cause cancer, lung cancer, among others, by itself. But in this fire, it absorbs these highly toxic other chemicals that also cause cancer and other things onto the carbon fibers, the carbon particles. And so when you look at what, can we go to the next slide? I think it's the wrong one. This chart summarizes, again, I don't presume anybody can see it, but the most serious health risk, I'll go over here, that's this column here. I mentioned before there are 8 chemicals that cause cancer on the train. There were 5 other chemicals that cause lifelong allergies. Think of it as asthma kind of things, and other types of allergy. And 3 to 5 chemical or products that cause serious liver, kidney, and lung damage, independent of cancer, poisons to those organs. And 3 chemicals or products cause reproductive effects. I've talked to enough women in this community to know that their cycles have been affected by this incident. In fact, one woman called me this morning and said she's going through it again today, 3 weeks early. And so these chemicals on the train were hazardous enough. But can we go to the next chart? And so in that context, the issues are larger than you've heard from other people. Now in this slide, I put 3 different dates up here. Here's the 3rd where the original derailment occurred. And what I'm illustrating is that you've had at least 4 exposure periods in this community. The 3rd was 1. If that was enough, then you got exposed again on the 6th when they exploded the vinyl chloride cars and ignited them. And then at least I'm aware that somewhere after the middle of February, so late February, they started digging up the contaminated burn pits and railroad base. Now you lived through it. I read about it. But what happens? They're stirring up all the chemicals that were in those burn areas. So you have a 3rd exposure that lasted for another period of time. And anytime the dust gets blown up, it's dust, it's got those chemicals attached to it. So that's a 3rd one. And then in 2024, and maybe before, I don't presume to have all of the data, but in this year, they started blasting the streams. Now, one of the ladies here took me around town a couple of days ago when I was doing some indoor air sampling in 3 homes. And she took me by some homes where your stream goes directly into the middle of the houses. Now, I'd heard that before, and I couldn't imagine. But I saw it. And there were 3 houses in a row where the stream's visible on this side. It goes under the houses, and then I can't see it again until it comes out the other side of the 3rd house. What are those people that live in those 3 houses being exposed to? Well, very hazardous chemicals cause the problems in those streams. And where did the chemicals come from? Two potential sources. One is that the water, if you will, and the liquid chemicals that were dumped alongside the railroad to burn flowed down that to the streams. That's one source. The other source is that the chemicals went up in the cloud, in the plume, and fell out of the plume over the streams. 2 potential sources, and potentially different chemicals. The ones flowing down could have been liquid, could have been raw chemicals, and the others would have been these mixed chemicals that were bound to the carbon particles. Well, the agencies involved felt it was strong enough that they needed to clean those streams. And I saw one set of maps from the federal EPA where they had a contractor come in and track the contamination in the streams. And they did it qualitatively. They didn't measure the materials or identify the chemicals, but they were looking for the sheen, the oil sheen that comes up when you disturb the sediment. And I was stunned that there was no place on either of the streams that wasn't graded a level 2 or 3, with 3 being the highest sheen level through the whole town. So again, where did the chemicals come from? Did they come running from the derailment site, or is that an indication that they just fell over the whole town? And what we're seeing is those that didn't float on the stream but settled to the sediment, and when you stir it, it comes back to the surface as oil sheen. Don't only use all those dynamics, but we do know there were a lot of chemicals in the streams because you had 43,000 fish die. That's how potent it was. And as a toxicologist, I used to study the effects of chemicals in animals to avoid having those effects occur in people. So we have an outdoor experiment, toxicology experiment in your community in those streams. And not just there. I'm aware there were cats and foxes and mink and other kinds of animals die. In fact, yeah, a couple of days ago, somebody showed me a lizard that I think was a pet, but it had died and they had it still in their freezer in case it was ever needed for research. So the context here is that you weren't just exposed once, and frankly, I don't believe that you've stopped being exposed, because I can't trust any of the data that's been developed by Norfolk Southern or EPA. There are too many instances now that we've documented where the data was falsified, left out, in other words, the bad data they didn't publish to the public, or they changed it. And we have very specific examples of where that happened. In fact, some of you might know Scott Smith, the man in the blue shirt. He's done unbelievable amount of work to figure out those complex databases from the government so that he can be very specific of changes that occurred. He's looked at the data, not very similar to me with the manifest that disappeared, but he found data on EPA's website at one time. When he went back later, they'd removed it because it was negative information. So I'm talking to you as a scientist, not as just a member of your community. I can't trust what EPA is saying. And that's the environment that we live in today. There are many agencies we can't trust. I used to use the Center for Disease Control in my toxicology reports and writing as one of my prime sources of information. I wouldn't do that anymore. With COVID and all the falsification that they had of data, I wouldn't trust the government data again. So the comment that I'm making here is that you have multiple definable exposures, and very likely those are continuing. Anytime dust is stirred up in this community, is likely to have these chemicals in it. Next slide. Now, this is simply one of the media pictures of the fire. I don't think you're very familiar with it, so why don't we just get past it? But these are some pictures that impressed me that I saw some of these on TV, if you will, news reports. This one, to me, is emblematic. I think you're probably familiar with it, but this is all plume. And it's just roiling. That's not just something moving up. It's stirring up. And the context here is, when I think about the volume of the chemicals that are in that, and know that it's black because it's carbon and it's soot and ash. Next one. Here's what happened to, there was there was a rail car, an auto rack, if you will, of cars on the train. In my version of the manifest, they said this didn't burn. And I didn't know that wasn't true until I started seeing pictures of the cars that did burn. And the problem is that these were electric vehicles that have lithium-ion batteries. And I coincidentally, thinking about my career being focused towards East Palestine, just while I'm starting in this East Palestine stuff, I was recruited to look at the waste industry and how do they dispose of lithium-ion batteries safely. And so I did the same research there as I did here. And I looked up what happens when you burn a lithium-ion battery. It's really bad stuff. Some of you may have had some irritation, little trouble breathing, your eyes burning, your skin tingling, your lips tingling. Those are irritants or corrosives. The difference being that irritants are temporary, corrosives burn you and that doesn't heal. Lithium-ion batteries release a product that is hydrofluoric acid. It is so corrosive, it's used in some industries to etch glass. So imagine what it does when it gets in your eye. Or you inhale it into your lungs. And that's what would come from these cars. And I apologize that we can't clearly see that. You can't clearly see that as well as I can on the screen. Let's go to the next one. There we go. Okay, now I'm sure you can't see this other than the colors. And there's some numbers here that I want to emphasize. This chart, by the way, is this chart, same one. So you can come up and look at it afterwards. But the thing I want to emphasize here is this is my detailed analysis of the manifest. There we go. So across the top, you'll see these segments are in different colors. Those are individual rail cars. Remember, they numbered them, and they said what was in them on the manifest. So I created this chart, and it runs from number 23, which is the first one, to number 74. So I counted for every car, their manifest said derail. And within that, the colors indicate the differences, if you will, between what happened in their manifest. So the red ones that you can see there are the ones that burned. Those are the 17 cars that burned. The gold ones, can you see it on this chart, the gold? Yeah, the gold ones, those are the ones that were impinged. I haven't tried to interpret what that means. I simply report what they said. Those were impinged. So that's the 32 cars that were involved in the fire. And when I looked up the size of each of those cars and found that about 200,000 pounds of materials carried in each car, on this chart, I calculated it. Now in this part, of the 17 cars that burned, there were 5,360,000 pounds of material. In the 15 cars that were impinged, there was 3,220,000 pounds. So together in that fire, there were 8.5 million pounds of chemicals and products put into the air. Just think of that. That's all, from a toxicology viewpoint, I've never seen anything like that before. There have been incidences where more people died. Unfortunately, nobody died on the 3rd of February here. But that's a lot of poison to put in the air. And where did it come down is a big question that's strongly debated. The lawsuit that was just finished up on Wednesday said it was within 20 miles of East Palestine, is the only area where there's any concern. My research said it very differently. Okay, thank you. Okay, now I'm going to switch to my detailed analysis. In the next 4 charts, I have identified, if you will, over here on the left, which you can't read, the chemicals and products that were on the train. The same list of 24 that we had in the first set of tables. In this case, I've listed here what were the toxicologic health hazards by burning those. And in the middle here, these are the chemicals. So over here, if I had, the first one up here is polypropylene. That's the inert plastic pellets. Now you'll notice that between the top here, these are the chemicals, individual chemicals that are released when you burn polypropylene. And originally in inert. In color, these are all chemicals from these are all indications of the health effects of these chemicals. And the yellow is cancer. So where you have polypropylene as an inert material on the train, and now you burn it, you produce, I think it's 8 different chemicals that cause cancer in all kinds of organs. One of the chemicals is, you probably heard a lot about, is dioxin. Make sure I got the right one. Where is dioxin? Oh, yeah. Okay, this is dioxin, and you have cancer here. And then I've listed the different organs that are affected by dioxin cancers. I think there are 8 in the medical literature. So if you don't get cancer in the lung from dioxin, you can get it in the liver or the kidney or other organs. And that depends upon the individual. And so the context here is that the decision to light that fire increased the hazards and risks to you people by maybe 1,000-fold. And the National Transportation Safety Board said it didn't have to be burned. Didn't have to light that fire. It was misinformation and miscommunication. It also happened to be very convenient for the railroad, so they could clean it up faster. And so the trade-off here was that the railroad's priority, based upon their actions, was to get the train running first. That's the first priority, so that their revenue stream continues. And igniting that fire was a big part of it. But it put the whole community, and one report, at least 16 different states at risk. People living in 16 different states. As a toxicologist, my frustration with the media is that they have all rejected my message that we don't even know who's been poisoned. The focus has been on you folks, and your focus has been on yourselves and the community. But we know across the border here in Arlington, a lot of people there have been very sick. And my first reaction when I saw this is, what about Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh is downwind. You're what, 4,500 people here in East Palestine or thereabouts? I forget the number, I looked it up once, but it's 200,000 or 300,000 people in Pittsburgh. And they don't even know they were affected. Nobody's told them. And that doesn't mean that they won't have the same long-term risks that you have. They just don't know it. You know that you've got some of those risks. And so the context here, let's go to the next one, we can go through that. And so, all I'm gonna say, and I was hoping I was wrong, but I didn't fill in all the cancers. Oops, I wasn't over here. I didn't highlight the cancers here, but maybe you can see some of these words. But the bottom line is that there are 8 chemicals or products on the train that could cause cancer. In this analysis, I've shown that there are over 120 chemicals that cause cancer in over 20 different organs and organ systems in our bodies. That's not George Thompson speaking. That's information I pulled from the scientific and medical literature. That the chemicals that fire created are highly, highly hazardous. Now, a number of you in here are almost as old as I am. And maybe that's not a high risk for cancer for our age group. But it doesn't mean that's the only effect those chemicals produce. Chris mentioned when he signed on, he's not an old guy like me, and he's already had heart and liver and kidney problems, serious ones. And he's conscious that this could limit his life. And so part of the reason I'm here today is to alert you that this is a serious consideration. And I know a significant part of your community have basically said, we're okay today, we're not going to worry about it. And I know that. I understood that long before I accepted the invitation to come here and speak. My hope is that some of you will talk to those neighbors that think there's nothing at risk and tell them what you're learning here today, at least conceptually. And I'll do this again over Zoom for others that want to see it. I've given it 2 or 3 times probably to different people here. But the concept is, let's go on through the list. I think we can skip the, oh, there's one thing. Okay, then, and just to show you, there are 4 pages. There went from 2 pages that were chemicals on the train. Now there's 4 pages here of tables of chemicals produced by the fire. But I want to emphasize, there's a group here. Let me just see if I can count. About 6 different chemicals. I put them in red to draw attention to them. Because if I put those on the table, I'm going to end up with 6 or 7 pages of tables. And you'd all be asleep by the time that was over. But those are highly hazardous chemicals. There are 13 of these materials, within these materials here, several of those cause cancer. Now, I'm not trying to embellish this issue. All I'm trying to say is that there is a lot of direct historical evidence that these chemicals are dangerous. Cancer isn't the only cause. You can die from lots of other things than just cancer. Go ahead. Okay, go ahead again. I've still got the red ones. Okay, now I want to, can we back up? Probably back up two charts if you can. I'm sorry. This is testing her ability here. One more. Yes, okay. There's a chemical here I want to mention to you. I think it's, let's see, which one is it? It's the 3rd one down, so it's this one. You can't see it. It's called semolina. Now, when I'm researching the chemicals that were on the train, I came to semolina and I said, what is that? Never heard of it. Had no idea what it was. So I went to the magical internet and I typed in semolina, and guess what pops up? Pizza flour. It's a food. Probably everybody in this room likes a good piece of pizza. But this is the flour that's used to make pizza dough. Whole train carload, 200,000 pounds of it. By itself, it has a hazard. It can cause asthma. So if people spend their career making pizza and they breathe in a lot of the dust flour, it can cause asthma in the pizza maker. But when you burn it, it's like the plastic pellets. Produces very similar hazardous chemicals as the plastic pellets that have all kinds of carcinogens. Unfortunately, I didn't highlight them in yellow here. But if you can squint, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 cancer-causing materials when you burn pizza flour. Now that's true whether you burn it in the pizza oven or you burn it in your East Palestine fire. You burn things like that, it releases these toxic chemicals. Okay, let's go down to the end. That one's not there. Now, the last one that you can't read is frozen vegetables. There's a whole rail car full of frozen vegetables. And I just kind of waved my hand and went past frozen vegetables. But when I got down to it in this list of chemicals that are burned, I said, I wonder what happens when you burn frozen vegetables. It's the same kind of products as semolina flour. You take standard frozen vegetables and burn them in this kind of fire that releases that huge plume, and you're gonna get a whole pile of chemicals that cause cancer and other toxic effects. Now, you don't think of that. People are gonna look at that as you did as you reacted when I said frozen vegetables. You just kind of wink at that. I did, until I looked up the materials that are produced. We can burn it, and it's not innocuous. Go ahead. So, this chart that you can't read compares what was on the train, where we have the 8 carcinogens, the 8 allergens, etc. On this side, whoops, I need to be pointing up here. And this is what's released from the fire. Now, I can't read it up here any better than you can, but I'll read it from here. I already said to you, there were 115 to 119 chemicals that cause cancer, compared to 8 that were on the train. Then there were 8 on the train that caused that were allergens. There were 5 more produced by the fire. 13 that caused liver and kidney effects from the fire. And reproductive effects, there were 3 over here. Over here, there were another 11. And these can affect either men or women. And I've heard more reports verbally from the women, but I've also talked to more women. But then I looked at what affects the heart. 45 chemicals from the fire, 42 affect the lungs, and 22 can cause asthma. Well, these are all very debilitating conditions, as Chris can attest to. You don't have to have cancer to be sick. And so in the context here, this fire stuff is very clear. Now, one of the points, you may all be aware of this, but there are visitors like me that come to your community. Back then, if I have a date on that, 3rd of April, so 2 months after the initial derailment, a group of 7 workers from the Center for Disease Control came here to monitor your community. They all developed a mysterious illness and left. And that's pretty common. I talked to a lot of attorneys who came here to recruit you folks as their clients, and they couldn't stay. Wow. That was pretty common. And frankly, that's the reason I haven't been here before. And I want to tell you very sincerely, the idea was first approached to me that I come here to give you this lecture and the one this afternoon. I had a conversation with my wife. What do I do? Should I do it or should I not? And the answer that we both agreed to is that I had to do it. You people deserve to hear from an unbiased person that understands the mysteries of God, and because I've lived through them in my life, so that you could have the truth. Now, I'm not here trying to sell anything. I've been paid for any of this. But I am here to help inform you. I'm not here to scare you. I want you to understand simply that this is serious. And there is a question, what's your community going to do? Next, please. So, one of the charts that I have over here, to my mind, this was one of, I guess I would call it a revelation. After I had done those charts, the tables that showed all the chemicals released by the fire, I asked myself, what happens when those all go up in the plume? Probably 200 or 300 different chemicals, all very hazardous. And we don't even know really what's in there, because as I've tried to show in this chart, this is a fire. And so those fires are breaking down the plastic into all kinds of chemicals. But those chemicals that are broken down are also in a heat environment, so they can react with other chemicals. So I can tell you what was formed by the plastic or the semolina or the frozen vegetables. I can't tell you what those chemicals formed. Experiments have never been done. But more as that one, as that chart illustrates, all of that, what I call the stew, went up in the air. But God's designed this world in a unique way. We have something called gravity. It's not going to stay up there. It didn't just get swept away from this community. Some of it fell on the community. Some of it was swept into other communities. And some of the articles I read said one article said 8 different states, one said 16 different states. Those people don't even know it, because nobody has really communicated this in the lay literature. And that's a concern to me. Next. Here's a plume dispersion. I'm certain you can't see that. But this is one that was, if you're familiar with NOAA, which is the National Oceanographic and Atmosphere Administration. It's a federal agency. And you hear about them a lot with storms like are happening in Florida right now. They have developed a piece of software that's known as HighSplit, just a name. But it forecasts when events and where materials are dispersed to. It's an air dispersion model. Well, models have their flaws. I wouldn't be here saying it's all correct. But I stumbled across this in some of my research one time, and I'm not an air dispersion expert, but I found this one very intriguing because it's the only model I've seen that was hour by hour for the full days of your burn. 2 compromises that I know in this analysis. One, it didn't start until 4 o'clock in the morning on the 4th. I don't remember the exact time, but I think yours started sometime in the late afternoon or evening on the 3rd. So they missed the first few hours. And then it went hour by hour all the way through the 7th. I would have preferred to go to at least the 8th or 9th so we could see what happened after the plume had basically dispersed. But this is the longest and most detailed one I've seen. And in that context, they show in this dispersion model that the plume, see if I can just read off of the screen a little bit. First it went southeast, which is what you would predict. That's the prevailing wind. What's southeast of here? Pittsburgh. So it went southeast to begin with. That was from 10 to noon, southeast over Pittsburgh. From noon to 2 o'clock, there was still a plume that went southeast, but it expanded to northeast. Not over Pittsburgh, going northeast from there, and to western Pennsylvania, and then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it shifted to northeast, which is almost north. Long ways from Pittsburgh, but that's the plume moving. Now I'm not going to go stall this out by going through all this, but the bottom line is that this model says that it went to southern Canada, all across over to Vermont and New Hampshire, hit the northern part of New Jersey, which is exactly where I live. Went down across West Virginia and Virginia, Delaware, and possibly Washington, D.C. I've read this article, so I know what they said that, but I haven't read it anywhere. I haven't heard any news report that this plume covered those states. In this analysis, according to my tabulation, this was about 126,000 square miles, not a 20-mile diameter circle around East Palestine. I've seen another publication that says it, I mentioned several times, covered 16 states, and they estimated in that article that the plume contaminated 526,000 square miles, 5 times what I had calculated here. So it went a lot of places. And what kind of land and water does that go over? We know it went over part of the Great Lakes because it was forecast to be in the upper, whatever you call it, peninsula of Michigan, above the Great Lakes. I think that's Illinois, if I remember right. But in that land, there's a lot of farming. I've heard nobody talk about food chain contamination. If those particles fell out, that soot and ash, when those chemicals bound, they're going to be on the ground. And of course, EPA's and Norfolk Southern's analysis, even in your community, is those are all levels below concern. Except when Scott Smith did his analyses, he didn't find those low levels. And then he went into the EPA public databases, he found they didn't find all low levels either. And when he found some high levels, he asked them, how can you say that this isn't a concern? It disappears. It's not in their public website anymore. And so there's just games that have been played with this. And the reality is that they're playing with your lives. And I would hope that you can develop a mindset after today that says, I'm not going to sit still for this. Because there are things in the works that can hopefully turn us around in an appropriate, proper way. Okay, now this is one of the things that I found with that mix of chemicals that's over here in that fire. Then I began to say, what are the medical ramifications? And so this is a list of chemicals. These are individual chemicals produced by the fire that cause skin, eye, nose, throat, and lung irritation. Anybody here ever experiencing that irritation? Yeah. Very commonly hear that, right? But there are 20 different chemicals that I've identified that cause that effect. 20. Next. Here are the cancers that I've identified 20 different cancers. You can't see the number, but 20 types of cancer produced by those fire-generated chemicals. And the types of cancer are listed down here. And I don't have all 20 on this one chart. But what I really want to show you is this is cancer of what's called the nasopharynx and nose. That's the breathing system, right? I forgot I had this in one of these charts. But that's the breathing system in the body. And look at the different chemicals. There's not just one chemical that causes that. Vinyl chloride I put on there is number one because you would know that one more from the chemicals you've heard about. But there are, let's see if I can count. I've got 7 on that chart, but the chart includes trace elements where there are 13 of those. And that's just causing cancer of your breathing system. But at the bottom of that breathing system are the lungs. And there are about 15 chemicals here that affect the lungs. And so what Norfolk Southern had already, but they used to pressure your attorneys to negotiate this settlement that I think is way too low, is you're going to have to prove every illness and what chemical caused it. That's the law. It's called specific causation. And I'm an expert witness. I've dealt with that in 56 cases. I've used it to beat some people, and I've used it to win for some people. In this case, that proviso no longer applies. Because you're not just exposed to one chemical. You're exposed to a stew of chemicals simultaneously. So if you breathe in, I think it's, what do I have right here? Yeah, if you breathe that in, I think that's soot, yeah. Soot and ash is right here. If you breathe that in, that can have dioxins, PAHs, and all kinds of other chemicals bound to it. So I can't tell you if it was your lung cancer from soot, or from ash, or from toxins. Can't tell you. Because you were exposed to them all at the same time. And that was one of the lever points that Norfolk Southern used in their negotiation for this settlement. So you can't prove specific causation. Now, I would hope that we could find a court somewhere someday that says in this unique situation, that proviso in law, which is the precedent, cannot hold. There have to be exceptions. Now, that would have to be established with a new case. Next chart. Now, these are cancer promoters. You can't see cancer promoters and hormone disruptors. So on the left-hand side over here are those list of 13 elements that are known to be cancer promoters. The cancer promoters are chemicals that don't cause cancer themselves, but they make faster and more cancers develop from chemicals that cause cancer. So it promotes the development of other chemicals causing cancer. And they're in here. And they come from several different products. The second column over here are hormone disruptors. PAHs, dioxins, phenol, toluene. There are 17 of them that I've identified from the fire. Is it a surprise that women in the community are saying that their cycles are changed? We know these chemicals affect hormones, but not just women's cycles. They can affect mood, they can affect our thyroid glands, our anxiety levels. I don't imagine any of you in here have anxiety. But many of these chemicals affect that because they change the chemistry in your brain. And this is an indirect way because they change your hormone levels. One of the hormones can be adrenaline from your adrenal glands. And you know that maybe is when you get excited, that's your adrenal glands firing. And much of your thought, and particularly reflective thought that just where you recycle this in your mind, is from that anxiety is due to your adrenal glands firing now and not stopping when there is no crisis. Next slide, please. These are neurological effects. I hear about quite a few of those. And these are the symptoms I'm going to read off here. You think in your mind if you've had any of these symptoms: headaches, dizziness, fainting, weakness, nausea, malaise, confusion, narcolepsy means unable to sleep, insomnia, judgment, coordination loss, mood, memory loss, seizures, coma. Long list. That's because the chemicals are affecting your brains. Neurology is the science of nerves and how they connect in your brain. And when that gets mixed up, you can have those kind of symptoms. And those can be intermittent, short in duration, or they can last a long time, depending upon what's there and what they've done to those nerve endings. Below that, I've listed the chemicals that are produced by the fires that can cause neurologic effects. And here, I'm using the pointer here. But aldehydes, carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is a gas produced by any fire, but in this case there were tons of it. Ketones, a special formic acid, methane, nitrogen oxides. These are chemical names, substitute of benzene and toluene. But that's a long list of chemicals that can affect your brains. And chances are you weren't exposed to just one. You could have been exposed to several. So what are you going to do about it? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit. Maybe you have some questions about that. Yeah, go ahead. I'm trying to be sensitive here to the duration. Now, this is some of Scott Smith's, the guy in the blue shirt, that did all the testing there, that shows garlic levels of dioxins. Now, this is the chemical that produces cancer in 7 different organ systems. But he shows here in the first column the numbers that were detected in the garlic from this garden the year before the derailment, so the previous summer's harvest. And most of the numbers are in the 3, 4, 5 range. One's as high as 14, but they're relatively low. But you look at the red column here, and they're all in the hundreds. Several hundred times the level. What does EPA say? Oh, don't worry about your gardens, there's nothing there. No concern. And yet the first analysis Scott does in garlic says don't eat that garlic. And the reason for it is that if you get garlic in your body, it stays there. It's considered a forever chemical. Thank you very much. It's considered a forever chemical because it stays in your body for 15 years doing its bad stuff. All the time's there because it gets stored in your body fat. And so the context here is a serious one. Not been studied. This is the only example that I'm aware of that even Scott's done. But it indicates that we can get these really potent forever chemicals in our food supply. And what happens if you have a pasture where the grass is growing with these chemicals, and that grass is eaten by some animal, sheep or cattle or pigs or whatever, and then you eat the sheep or cattle or pigs. That chemical passes right up the food chain. Not talked about, not considered in the lawsuit. Okay? Okay, now this is one of your locals. Ashley McCollum, who isn't here today because she can't come into town without getting sick. She's going to be at the afternoon session because it's not in East Palestine. But I saw her testify on, I think it was a Pennsylvania public hearing. And I probably saw it on YouTube, but I've forgotten where. So I reached out and contacted her. In that hearing, she read off 95 symptoms that people in East Palestine had told her occurred to them. I took those 95 symptoms and put them in different columns. Now you can see the columns, you can't see any of the symptoms. But I sorted them out from a medical perspective so that we would indicate which parts of the body would have been affected for that symptom or those symptoms in that column to have occurred. And you can see there, I don't know, 12 or 13 or 14 columns. So these chemicals that we're talking about here in this stew affected all kinds of your body, some relatively minimal, and you may have experienced them sometime in the past, and now you don't have those symptoms anymore. But don't discount the symptoms if you still have them 20 months later. Your body's talking to you. And so listen to it and do what you can to alleviate those symptoms. Next. Oh, the other thing that I want to emphasize, sorry, almost forgot it. On the bottom of this, maybe you can't see that. There are no health standards for exposure to mixtures of highly hazardous chemicals. Only single chemicals. So in this gamish, there are no health standards for this kind of situation. EPA doesn't have them, OSHA doesn't have them, CDC doesn't have them. Nobody has standards for mixtures of chemicals. It's too complicated for them to figure out. It's very complicated here. And the second note I have is that there are hundreds of East Palestine plume contaminants identified from incomplete combustion of single chemicals. So it starts with a single chemical and now it's created hundreds. Unfortunately, you'd be exposed to those at the same time. And we don't know what other chemicals were produced in that ball of fire. I already said that. I've identified a couple hundred chemicals that are produced by fire from a single chemical. But now you put those together in a very intense fire, and you don't know what's coming out of that. There is no data for it. Okay, you're familiar with this. I want to talk about this a little bit. You can see that plume goes up, and one of the doctors that testified for the plaintiff's attorney said it went up high in the sky. Does that look like it? It went up 3,000 feet and plateaued. That's not my picture. That's one I took out of the media. But you can see the pancake. It's at 3,000 feet because there was a temperature inversion. And it made it stay closer to the ground. Right, next. Here's one that you can see is more nebulous than that's bigger. it's spread out more. It's not as refined. Here's one that's at a farther distance, and that pancake is getting bigger. I've never heard anybody say how big that cloud of ash is in the sky. Don't know how many miles that covers, but it covers a long ways from one side of this picture to the other. That's got to be measured in miles. Next. Now this is the one that really got my attention. This picture, you may have seen it, was taken from an airplane as they were flying over this part of our country. And you can see that pancake effect. Well, unfortunately, in the image you don't see as well. But this is all that pancake effect. And maybe if you imagine, you can see this is bleeding off a little bit. That's where when I first saw this, I said that's bleeding off directly towards Pittsburgh. Looks to me like that's heading southeast. Unfortunately, this picture wasn't descriptive as to which direction was northeast, south, or west. But it did suggest to me that it was going southeast. But as I've already said to you, I've looked at air dispersion models that say it wasn't consistent. Your prevailing wind may be in that direction, southeast towards Pittsburgh, but it's not the only direction. And it wasn't during that week of the fire either. Next. Here's another one. I'll see if I can describe this. This is somebody else's forecast. On the 6th, prior to the burn. Now, what I understand happened is that between Norfolk Southern contractors and EPA, they looked at this forecast. It said the primary concerns, the highest concerns are right here near East Palestine. The southeast wind is going to carry it this far. And as you move away, the danger gets less because of dilution. But the reality is, which you can't see as well in this picture up here, but there's a purple color here. That's the actual on the 6th. Very different than what they were forecasting and making their decisions about. Let's see what the next slide is. Okay. This slide I've created this slide from the writing of the analytical chemist that was hired by the plaintiff attorneys. And he spent, I forget, 6 or 7 months here taking samples. And he wrote his report. Never seen it, never heard of it. The plaintiff's attorneys had him under a confidential agreement, so he can't talk about it. And they've never released it to the people in the community that were their clients. They never released it to the court. Many of us are asking the question, pregnant question, why not? And the answer has to be that it was showing very high levels of contamination. And they couldn't negotiate a quick, massive plaintiff fee agreement if that report was put up today. Now that fellow looked at the data that Scott Smith developed and his methods, and he concluded that Scott Smith's data that was talking about high levels of these forever chemicals that he detected was all correct. So he couldn't talk about his own data, but he could talk about Scott's. And one of the things that was submitted to the court for Wednesday's hearing was an affidavit from Stephen Petty, this expert that the plaintiff attorneys had hired, complimenting Scott on his work. An affidavit from Scott Smith talking about all of the shenanigans the EPA had done, and mine that talked about many of the things that you're going to see here, that you have seen. And the court said, I read them, and went on to question the attorneys. That was it. No comment. And all of us were lobbying that there is a delay in the hearing decision to ratify the agreement until time for this data to be accumulated. Didn't happen. She ignored our 3 affidavits and made her decision to proceed. And I assume by now all of you know that she approved the agreement. I'm not gonna go through this, I've already talked about it some, about the one that started at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 4th, and went through the 7th, here I am again, went through the 7th of February, hour by hour. And this is the one that said it covered at least 8 different states in southern Canada. Southern Canada all the way over north of Vermont and New Hampshire. This is the one that the analysis that said it covered 16 states. Now, I'm not going to argue about 16 versus 8 states and who's right and who's wrong, but in the context here is that it's a lot more than East Palestine. I don't know that any of this data was considered by the court. I've never seen anything in what was submitted that says this is very serious, not to just East Palestine. That's what they've tried, that's what they've successfully done so far, is to keep you folks in the bullseye. It's only East Palestine. We've got this great agreement, it's gonna take care of all of you. But that's not what this data says. And it's not what my data says. The conclusion, I'm not gonna go through the details here, because probably many of you know it, but this is from a statement made by the NTSB chairperson. Her name is Jennifer Homendy. They came here and studied what had happened with the railroad. National Transportation Safety Board came here. And her primary conclusion, we can say, is this was preventable, 100% preventable. That was her conclusion. Unfortunately, NTSB has no policing authority. So that's in the record that it was preventable. But that decision to light the fire was wrong. It shouldn't have happened. And there is no mechanism to put muscle behind this. Next. Now, I'm going to go through these next 2 charts fairly quickly because this is just my thinking. This isn't data driven that I've shown you to this point. This is my personal thinking. I've talked to 4 to 6 people about it, but it's no consensus. But my perspective is that there are next steps. This is titled Next Steps for Community, Family, and Worker Safety Assurance. There are two pages to this. I'm just going to go through a couple of highlights. The first one is the President Biden declared a Stafford Act master disaster for East Palestine, Ohio area, which makes all kinds of funding from federal agencies available. That's the first step. But within that first step, one of the things that I would like to see is inserted into the agreement, a missing element, and that is that the government requires Norfolk Southern to fund a medical program here that includes 2 elements. One is that they make a list of all the people who lived here that have potential for exposure. Create a census of all of you. And take that out as far as we want. We take it just here, or 20 miles out, or into Pennsylvania. But we make a census of the people who are potentially exposed. And the logic behind that is all of you will remember 9/11. The terrorists blew up the towers. You had an accident, another plane go down Pennsylvania. There were just shy of 3,000 people died that day. 20 years after, another 4,200 people died from their exposures on that one day. And 20 years later, after the incident, 71,000 people were affected with serious medical issues. You don't hear about that. I found that in one publication, and it wasn't broadly disseminated. That publication wasn't. That's my fear for East Palestine. Nobody died. I'm grateful for that on the day, or even that week. But what I can see coming is just like 9/11. We're gonna start seeing deaths and serious illnesses accumulate. And with the kinds of chemicals that are in that stew, they're gonna complement each other. I heard when I went down to the medical conference where the plaintiff's medical physician made a presentation last Friday, and I heard physicians there say, oh, it couldn't be from the cancers in East Palestine can't be from the derailment, because we've had 4 here now that I know of. And the response is, after 9/11, the first cancers appeared in the first 3 to 6 months after 9/11. Because there, like here, you had this big mix of hazardous chemicals. And so you can't use the standard medical thought that it takes 20 or 30 years for cancer to develop. That's not applicable when you've got this unusual mix of exposures. Now, the second one that I have here is that, in this case, is that there's a disaster worker medical evaluation treatments. In all the pictures I've seen of the incident, of the cleanup here, I've never seen any worker wearing personal protective equipment. No air masks, respirators, no gloves, no body suits, and they're stirring that dust up as they're getting those train tracks ready for trains to run again. All of those people are highly exposed, probably more than most of you. And it's going to happen quickly, as it did after 9/11. The third thing here is compile and reassess the Norfolk Southern and EPA-generated air, water, and soil test results to define the true scope and extent of contamination. There are millions of data elements that have been accumulated. The critical ones have probably been modified or left out of the public database. Somebody independently needs to be given legal authority to go in and look at that data and reanalyze it. It's a high priority. Next chart. Establish a congressional committee to investigate EPA malfeasance and failures of duty to warn. They did not properly let you people here in ground zero know the hazards, nor have they let the people in Pittsburgh or any of the other 16 states. The EPA is basically taking a position. There's nothing to report here. The fifth one is emergency funding for independent environmental and toxicological science that are not university. Do sampling and pollution analyses here. In other words, one of the elements there is test every one of your homes. Get funding so that we can test every home here, so you know what's in your circumstance. We're 20 months later. As a toxicologist, my goal was that this would have been done 2 or 3 months after the incident. But it's better to do it now than later. And then the last one, establish and require Norfolk Southern to establish a $3 billion trust fund to compensate impacted families, properties, and livestock in the East Palestine area. In other words, anybody here who wants to sell their home and relocate, or sell their business and relocate, Norfolk Southern pays you a fair market value to do that.
Amen.
So that even though you've been exposed for 20 months, it can happen. And is that the last one? Close. Oh, no. Okay. I'm going to switch now a little bit to what my suggestion to you is you can do. The questions that I would have posed, that I posed if I were here, is why me, why East Palestine, and why now? I don't know that those are the right questions. I suspect there are questions in many of your minds. But one of the things that I recall is this quote, can't remember who it's from. It's not the struggle that defines us, but how we choose to deal with the struggle. That's going to be the character that's inside of us. My decision to come here today, knowing that I could get contaminated or poisoned, this is where I want to be. And in case you don't know it, You're all adopted members of the Thompson family. By definition, and agreement with my wife. Now, I want to stimulate with you a little bit here, some deeper thinking of this question, why me, and what do I do now? God said to Abraham that in the planning stages for this world, God said, and we will prove them herewith to see if they will do all things whatsoever their Lord God command them, and they shall have glory added upon their heads forever. This is a test. I don't need to tell you that. You know it. Some of you don't like it. Maybe all of you don't like it. And you don't want it. But we were sent here by a loving Heavenly Father because He loved us and He wanted us to choose to do good things even when bad things are done to us. It's a test. And in the end, you're going to be blessed. What does He say here? Have glory added upon their heads forever and ever. So after this life, one of the things that's conscious to me is that I'm going to be able to stand in front of my stage and say, I chose to go to East Palestine, even if it meant it was the last thing I did. Second thing, the two greatest commandments. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. It's in Matthew. These kinds of circumstances probably have many of you praying regularly with your own set of unique questions, asking why, what do I do, what can I do, etc. But the second one, the second great commandment, is that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. You're not only my neighbor, you're in my adopted family. And what would I do if I were here and you were somewhere else? New Jersey, God forbid. And so the question is, what do you want to do for your neighbors? Because that's part of what God's going to judge you for. You're in the middle of this crucible. And there are lots of different choices you can make to react to it. But the one that He said is the second greatest commandment is to love thy neighbor. Be sensitive to their circumstances and their needs and help minimize them. Next, no, let's go back one more. Backward. I didn't finish your couple more. She's trying to get to the end. Yeah, there we go. Okay. Now here's an interesting challenge. Prove me herewith, saith the Lord of hosts, if I will not open you the windows of heaven and pour you out a blessing, that there shall not be room enough to receive it. Now that's stated in the book of Malachi, and he's talking about paying tithing. Why would somebody want to pay tithing? Well, he's saying, prove me. Pay your tithing and see if I won't bless you. I paid tithing my whole life in my church. And I can tell you there are times when I have not had enough, but I have had enough. And there have been times where I've had plenty. And it's because of that concept. So think about what your relationship is with your Maker, because He's in control of this whole thing. He's in control of Norfolk Southern, UPA, and George Thompson. And you. And here's a statement from another statement from Matthew, the last one. Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and ye gave me meat. I was thirsty, and ye gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and ye clothed me. I was sick, and ye visited me. I was in prison, and ye came to me. Inasmuch as ye have done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. There's a lot in the life of looking out. Criticizing, anger, frustration at the people on the outside that are contributing to your uncertainties. Turn it around and look from the inside as to what you can somebody said they thought that the number of deaths of increase in East Palestine. So we can take a survey. How many deaths occurred in East Palestine 2 years before? And since? And is there a change? That's a piece of information nobody knows the answer to yet. But it would be contributory if we did. And so, we go to the next one. I think that is it. So, I've had miracles throughout my life. Daniel, I saw my son walk in just a minute ago. I don't see him now. But one of those was to be blessed. Come on in, Daniel. Would you come up here for a minute? Dan, come on up a minute. Okay. No, come here. Just walk up here for a minute. He's going to move his car. Come up here for just a minute. Let everybody see you. I told you we had 5 children in 6 years. You could just have a seat for a minute. He was the 5th. He was the caboose. And when he was 3, he was diagnosed with autism. I never heard of it. But I realized that I had been trained in toxicology, graduated in 1969, and psychopharmacology. I never used psychopharmacology until Daniel was born. And at that stage, 26 years later, I could talk to physicians all over the world about what's the state of the art with autism. And because of that medical training, on that side of the equation, not toxicology, but on the medical side, I was led to 2 articles that told my wife and I how to raise him. Now, he graduated from high school, member of the National Honor Society. He learned in high school, much to our shock, how to drive a car. He now has his own transportation business, and he drove me here a 6-hour drive. And in my old age, I'm 81, he takes care of his mother and I. When he was little, we worried about how we would take care of him when we get old, never imagining the blessing that he would be in our lives. That's how we as mortals can't always understand the workings of God. And so I just give you that as one example that I was prepared 26 years before his birth. All the training I needed. I was prepared for 55 years before your incident in 2023. God knew that. He knew you were going to need a toxicologist that would be honest and truthful. And so the question is, what did he prepare you to do? Because you're all part of this family. You're all part of this issue. And pray to God and ask him what you can do to help your neighbors, to love your neighbors. You might be surprised at some of the answers that come. I'd like to just comment briefly that you can't see it again, but Scott Smith's up here. He's the one that you might know as the man in the blue shirt. Scott Smith is very different than I am. But he is an angel. And without Scott Smith coming here and taking those samples, it says you can't trust what other people tell you about the exposure levels. And without getting them to me, and that data when Garlic was him sending them to me. Without him, we wouldn't be where we are today. The next step that I have here is for you to be aware that there's a group here called Justice for East Palestine Residents and Workers. And some of your people here discovered that a month ago, 6 weeks ago. And we've all become contributors to that group. The head of that program lives on the West Coast. He's trying to unite all of the unions in the country in your behalf. Nothing that I know anything about. And then the last one I have here, well, it's not the last one, but you also have something called the Unity Council here. When I first got really involved Alice is, I think, head of that group, and she's the one that introduced me to others that literally supplement this program. Now, I don't have all the names here, but there are a dozen or 2 dozen members of your community that have fed me data, have asked me questions, that have challenged me with questions that they have, that have helped me do what I do. And you can do that for each other. So I would ask everybody in this room, what can you do to help your neighbors? I'm not the one that answers that. God is. The answer that I got, come and speak to these people in Wisconsin so they know they have a friend. And don't be afraid to ask him for miracles in your life. I've had lots of them. I should have died 5 times in my life. I've been in East Palestine, but I died one of those times. It wasn't his purpose. So find out what your purpose is. He gave you this problem so you would turn to him, and he can answer your prayers and prove to you how much he loves you personally. And that then measures up across the whole world. I'll stop there, and I appreciate your patience. Sure.
My name is Mike Stout, and I'm from the Pittsburgh area. I'm a musician, a retired steel worker, and I read about East Palestine when it happened, and people began sending respirators and trying to help the people here. But what really hooked me in and made a big difference for me was when I met Chris Albright, and I met Krista, and I met Ashley, and I met Chrissy, and I met the people and got connected to them, what they were going through. And I'm here, and Robin's here, and people are here. We're here with you till the end, whatever that end is. We're not walking away from this, because we've learned from Dr. Thompson that whatever you're going through here, we're going to go through in Pittsburgh if we're not going through it already. And when I think about like something like this, and I know a lot of you do too, you think, well, oh my God, I'm like, so what do we do? What the heck do we do? We got sold out by the EPA, we got sold out by Norfolk Southern, we got sold out by the government. What do we do? Well, I can tell you what we can do. Number one, we can take this presentation and condense it a little bit, and each one of us get it to our neighbors, get it to our families, get the truth out. Our number one weapon that we have as citizens is the truth. And we need to get the truth out. And number two, I just want to let you know, I hope you caught what Dr. Thompson said about that hearing on this past Wednesday, is you had Dr. Thompson's evidence and affidavits and his presentation. You had also Scott Smith, who has been here, if you don't know it, 27 times he's been here in a 9-month period, testing hundreds and hundreds of people, houses, places, etc. They refused, the courts, to admit, not only admit his testimony, but they badmouthed him and smeared him and said he was a kook, said he was crazy. Then on top of that, we have Stephen Petty, who was the toxicologist hired by the EPA to test. And he's got a gag order. He's not allowed to tell you what he found here. But he can tell you this, that what Scott Smith found, he agrees with it. And he says it's legitimate. So now you got, on top of those 3 people, you have 3 other toxicologists who are whistleblowers. All of that information was not allowed to be presented in court. So I just want you to know here, I'm not quite sure how it's going to fall out, but that court decision that was rubber stamped by the judge is being appealed. And I hope it's being appealed not once, not twice, but at least by 4 or 5 different agencies and different people and different organizations, and for the people of this community. And that struggle is going to go on, and the truth will come out. And the truth will only come out if you help it come out. I don't know, is there anybody here, tell me the truth, that doesn't at least watch an hour of TV or movies on their internet or whatever? Is there anybody here? I don't think so. We're going to take this presentation, we're going to condense it down to an hour. Show it to your family, show it to your friends, show it to your neighbors, show it to your co-workers if you're lucky enough to still be working, and let's get the truth out. And let's let the people in Western Pennsylvania, which we're going to do, Robin and I and others, know they're in the same boat as you. They're not in a separate boat. They're not in a separate sea or a separate lake. We're all in the same lake, and we're all in the same boat, and we're going to fight this fight with you. Thank you.
So I want to thank everybody for coming out. We're not quite done yet, but we're really getting close to wrapping everything up. Like Dr. Thompson said, with the Unity or Justice for East Palestine residence workers, I'm one of the founders of that there. If anyone would like any information about that, I'd love to hand that out to you guys, let you guys know that you guys be a part of it. And from there, though, I am going to open it up to any questions for Dr. Thompson that anybody might have. Presented a whole lot of information today.
Is there any testing that could be done for any of that you were talking about, the cancer, the brain, like, that you can do toxicology tests for people?
The question, good suggestion. The question was, is there any testing that can be done for these hazard effects? I have two pieces of advice in that regard. First of all, each one of you should fill out a detailed journal. Go back to the 3rd of February, the best you can remember now, and record your journal. What happened? What were your symptoms? As best you can remember them, etc., so that there's documentation going forward. The second, coming to the question, is if you haven't had one recently, have a thorough physical examination. Both of those form a baseline, so that something does deteriorate in the future, then you can fall back to your clinical diagnosis, a physician that says, here's what it was the 1st of October of 2024, and then if this condition develops later in years, that's documented. And the second is that you can present that journal thing in case that's needed for one of the appeals that we are talking about, or for your own circumstances involved in the future. Great question. A question in the back over here.
I was wondering, you spoke to a lot of residents, East Palestine and Darlington. Has any of them brought up to you that they've been diagnosed with what is called lichen planus?
I don't understand the term. Say it one more time.
Lichen planus.
No, I don't know what that is.
Lichen, and then the next word, Planus.
And so the first one is like the mold or mildew lichen.
It's not it attacks the mucous membranes. It's an immunity dysfunction,
Yeah.
It doesn't have to do with a fungus.
No, okay, I don't know. I've heard nobody about that, but by the way, I do have some business cards up here. If you have questions that you would like to just write to me, email. I try to go through my email each day. I'm behind a bit being on this trip, but I try to look at emails 3 or 4 times a day. So don't hesitate on a question like that, and I'll look it up and see what the implications are. Yes?
I just wanted to make a comment to the guy that asked about if they can look at cancers and stuff. There's a lot of researchers that are helping from universities too, and they'll do blood tests and urine tests and everything as time goes on. Dr. Gullum is one, and
They're real good.
Case Western Reserve University is another one.
Now, there are 6 universities that received grants from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, and their studies, I think all 6 of them are for 2 years, maybe longer, but I think for at least 2 years. And a month or so ago, I heard their status report, I think it was in August, and they, I think it was the University of Kentucky, identified that they found vinyl chloride in the blood of 18 different people that they tested. So that's ongoing. doing different kinds of things here. But oftentimes they're looking for volunteers to participate in those studies. Yes?
I've just got a comment about what you said about what to do now. My name's Tony Lane. I help get out articles about the fight here in the militant newspaper and with the Socialist Workers' Party. I thought your comment about the need for a lifetime medical care funded by Norfolk Southern, fighting around that. I think that's a big thing to take out to working people across the country. You also mentioned some of the people who got exposed most heavily, which includes the track workers who are employed by Norfolk Southern, who are just shipped in here, thrown out there, not knowing what they're doing. And you can see on video from the TV stations, there's no PPE except the normal PPE you would use, not in the situation there. Some of those workers in the union, the track workers union, are fighting this. And I think that's what's got to be tied up here, is the fight by workers and the unions and with working class communities and farmers and small business people across the country to fight around this. Another thing I think it exposes the need for us to have a way to fight that's independent of, someone mentioned that the government's against us. Well, that's the Democrats and the Republicans, so we've got to have a way to fight against them both. So that's what my party is about, the idea that working people need to fight for that.
I'd like to reinforce the idea that workers, the Justice for East Palestine residents and workers is a union-oriented group. And they're trying to get support from unions around the country for the work in East Palestine and how this whole situation has been covered, including the railroad workers who were brought in to clean up that mess. Other questions? Yes?
If there were testing results done at home, a few months after, that did show contamination, would you be interested in that?
Oh, absolutely.
Can you repeat the question?
No, sorry, thank you. The question was, if there was testing in your home, would I be interested in seeing the results of that? And absolutely. I've got a number of those I've been accumulating, but the context is that that'll be personal between you and me on a confidential basis. And if I do expose it, it won't identify you as the source, but it would become one of those additional symptoms, if you will. But I would send back my interpretation of those results. Glad to do it for anything. Okay, I told several of you coming in there'd be a final exam.
Just beforehand, maybe we'll do a little extra prep moments. We have a couple of questions online, if that's okay.
Oh, yes, sure.
We have the question, where can I get my soil tested? If you have any insight on that beyond what's already been done.
The best place that I can suggest is reach out to Scott Smith. I know he's done lots of soil testing. I don't know what his future is going to be in this, whether he's going to be coming back or not, but perhaps he could receive samples that you've taken and analyze them. But that's what I would say for soil. I would go
There's
to-
a home in Brighton that you can contact yourself regarding soil testing.
And what is that in New Brighton? Is that a company?
Yeah,
Okay.
I can tell you where it is. It's not the other town, just before Linda's out. I can't remember the name of it.
We can talk later, and then I'll be happy to put it in the chat.
Yeah, they
Appreciate
did.
that.
Yep, thank you.
We have a question, will the actual sample data also be available? Now, I believe that you found this publicly available data for your analysis. Is that correct? Is that where we can direct people to for the raw data, or whatever is your guidance is, we would love to hear it.
The problem that I have is that I have spreadsheets of data from EPA. And I know that they have, I've heard the numbers, but it's in the millions of the elements. And my job, and Scott's job, is to go through and look for the concerns, what was a concern. The problem is, we can't trust their data. And so that's why one of our next steps was to independently evaluate all that data. Because in some cases they've changed it, in some cases they've removed it from the public database and put it behind the curtain. And so my conclusions are are based upon my analysis, which I explained to you today, and data I've seen from Scott Smith. He's got no bigger ass to grind on this than I do. I saw, oh, wait, another one on go ahead, ask your question.
Norfolk and Western's a notoriously anti-union operation. Likewise, so on the train, there were only 2 trainmen, I believe, and they would have been union. But all those people who came and did the cleanup, do you know if they were unionized? And I doubt if they were wearing proper equipment. Do you know if they?
I don't.
They were non-union, and they were brought in from out of state. And also, a lot of people, if you don't know it, we have like video footage, they rotated them, so they only came in for a week, then they brought another crew in the next week, then another crew. Nobody was in here for longer than a week, so they knew something was seriously wrong.
Did you have another, Robin?
Yes, why do you think the EPA projected plume was so different from the one presented in purple, the one in your earlier slide?
Well, the conclusion that I have is that for whatever reason, one of them is political. Why didn't Biden come here for a year? I don't have a logical answer to that. But it's not inconceivable that the word was expressed to the courts and to the agencies that nothing happened here. Because EPA said it's safe within less than 2 weeks. They didn't have one scrap of data to make that statement.
If they would have said they were here, they couldn't have sent it to Ukraine.
Yeah. Well, let's bring some of the Ukrainians. But I don't have data to support that. I don't have facts to support that. But it just looks to me like to use the vernacular, the fix was in. I don't know why. But why would they essentially, you see, one of the things that bothered me about the $600 million settlement, that sounds like a lot of money to you and me. But that's a $12 billion a year company. And some of the provisions in that agreement spread over 20 or 25 years.
You don't seem to understand what the railroad pay people in Washington DC.
Yeah, sure.
To do what they want.
Thank you.
And it has always been like, I work for the railroad.
But
I
you don't,
know what they do.
but you think you can't trust the people in Washington?
No.
You probably have full agreement with people in this room. Any other questions? Robin, did you have them?
Not online at the moment, thank you.
Okay, any other questions?
Just if anybody wants to, please, if you haven't signed the sign-up sheet, the people that signed the sign-up sheet and gave us an email address or phone number, we can send you Dr. Thompson's presentation. And then you can share it with your neighbors and friends and so on and so forth. So it's paramount that we get the truth out.
Now, if you people don't reach out to me after this, I'm gonna become very lonely in my retirement. So I'm looking forward to emails and phone calls. If you didn't get a business card, I think they're over here. Are they still in there? So don't hesitate.